Okay, well, good evening. I'm Rod Schaub, and I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. We have with us tonight, we have a couple of speakers. We have Cassandra Olds and AJ Tarpoff. But before we get started, I'd like to thank my coworkers that are here with us this evening. Darren Hibden from the Ottawa office, Ryan Schaub from down at Garnett, and Madison Maurer, who is our office professional that's doing the recording and some of those kind of things for this evening's presentations. This evening, we're going to split our time up into two different talks. And the first talk will be Cassandra Olds. She is a livestock entomologist up at K-State. And at least we haven't had an extension entomologist for quite some time. So it's great to have her on board so she can share some of her information with us. And she's going to talk to us tonight about fly control strategies. And then the second half of the meeting, we'll have AJ Tarpoff, our beef extension veterinarian. He's going to be back on, and he will talk to us about anaplasmosis. Tell us if there's anything new, and maybe Cassandra will stay around because I know that ticks are vectors of anaplasm, so maybe she can help us out as well. So with that, Cassandra, I'd like to turn it over to you. Welcome, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I'm going to try and stick to my 25-30 minute allotment. It's hard because I get excited about flies and ticks and all these things, but we're gonna try. So as per my introduction, I'm the new veterinary entomologist. I joined the Department of Entomology already about a year ago now, and this position does have an extension component, and it's something that was not really fulfilled in the past. So I'm really excited to get back out there and share what's new, hear what problems there are, and just really get that program up and running. So we're going to talk about flies, and specifically flies as pests, but I just want us to think about in nature that we really don't have pests in nature. So although animals in nature do get parasitized, by and large, they're not heavily parasitized. And this is because of a number of reasons. So this is a wonderful picture of the African savanna where I'm from, and it really highlights why insects don't become pests as we know them in our agricultural systems. So firstly, you'll see there's different species of animals. So most insects are host specific, so they prefer one kind of animal species over another. The second thing we have is wide open spaces and animals that are moving around quite a bit. And then the last thing we have are things that eat these insects, so natural predators. So let's compare this to what we have in our agricultural settings. So firstly, we've only got one species of animal. We generally confine them in quite close quarters. So even if they're on pasture, they're still relatively close together. They can't escape the larval breeding habitat. So here we have a cowpat and we have the animal that's right next to it. I'm going to just get my laser pointer here so we can see better. Here's the cowpat. And unless you have chickens running around with your livestock, there really aren't too many natural predators that these flies are going to encounter. So what's happened is our agricultural practices really create an environment which promotes the development of these insect populations, and then they become a pest. So what we have to really do is start to look at the environment which we've created and manage that in a way that we can reduce insect populations so that they're no longer at pest levels. So I'm going to talk about some flies now, and I'm going to talk a bit about the biology of the fly, because if you understand the biology of the fly, you can make really strategic interventions to control these populations. So blood-feeding flies that we worry about with cattle are the stable flies and the hornfly. And so all these flies you'll notice are pretty similar looking, at least from a distance. So how do you know if you've got a stable fly? If you're up close, what you can see is it's got these spots on the body over here, in contrast to the hornfly that really has this dull sort of gray color. They both kind of have stripes on this thorax region. One of the big distinguishing characteristics is the mouth part. So the stable fly really has this long proboscis, and when you see it resting, it kind of, you can see it just coming out from underneath the head of the fly. whereas the hornfly has these slightly shorter mouth parts. So for both of these, both adult males and adult females feed exclusively on blood. And so where we see these on the animal is your stable flies, you'll normally find them on the legs of the animal. And if you think of the fly as a triangle, and here I have a little picture here, the head faces upwards, so it faces towards the sun. So if you're looking from a distance and you see your triangle is facing upwards, more than likely you've got a stable fly. Hornfly, they tend to be on the back of the animal, and then as the population grows, they will go to spread over more of the animal, and when it gets really hot outside, they will go to the underbelly, but for the most part, they're on the body of the animal. And they feed with their head pointing down. So if your triangle point is towards the ground, it's more than likely a hornfly. Then we have two non-biting fly species that we worry about. That's the face fly and the housefly. And these two are very, very similar. You can see from these two pictures here, they're almost indistinguishable. One of the big characteristics that you can use to tell the difference is that the face fly has a darker abdomen, and the underside of the abdomen is gray, whereas your housefly has this creamy yellow underbelly. And so where they like to be on the animal, the face fly, as the name suggests, they like to be on the face of the animal. And so they're actually one of the vectors for bovine pink eye. So as they fly from animal to animal, they pick up the bacteria and transmit it to new animals. Only the females are feeding on the cattle. The males just hang out and feed off plant nectar. But what these females are looking for is they're looking for these blood and secretions from wounds and from the eye, which provide them with protein, which they use to make their eggs. And so then our houseflies, this is normally a problem in confined animal operations, and this is not just cattle. This is anywhere where you have large numbers of animals congregated, you more than likely find these houseflies. And although we see them on the animals and they will feed off the animals' eyes, for the most part, what we actually see them on is the surfaces. So this is a video which should play here. And you can see here that the flies are not really sitting on the animals as much as they are in the feed bunker. And you can see as the animal lowers its head and disturbs the flies, they fly around. So these are the 4 species of flies that we're really going to be talking about during this talk. And so from our descriptions of where you'll find them on the animal, you'll see that they're quite specific in where they like to be. But they're also very specific in where they like to lay their eggs. So they do have preferred sites. And knowing what these sites are means that you can evaluate what your risk is for the fly population and where you can really make meaningful interventions. And I will say that no matter which species you're looking at, flies have a phenomenal reproductive capacity. So each adult female fly lays hundreds and hundreds of eggs. So the ability of them to really have these explosive population booms is phenomenal. And that's why we need to control them before they become adults to kind of hold this massive explosion that we see. And that's also why sometimes you'll go from having no flies to having tons of flies everywhere. And this is just because of their massive, massive reproductive capacity. And so all of these flies have an egg stage. They have 3 larval stages. We normally call these maglets. These then go into a dormant pupal stage. And this is where our insect growth regulators that we're going to talk about are important. And then they merge into the adult stage. So normally all you'll see is the adult stage, but they really have this whole other part of their life cycle going on that we just don't pay as much attention to. So when we're looking at the breeding habitats, this is where you need to be looking at your production and seeing where you can identify these areas where your flies might be breeding. So stable flies love fermenting, decaying plant matter. So anywhere where you have decomposing plant matter, they are going to lay as many eggs as they can and be very, very happy. One of our prime areas where this happens is around hay bales. So especially as these hay bales start to disintegrate, when they get wet and they start having manure and urine mixed into it, that is perfect stable fly habitat. Our hornflies are a little bit more picky. They only want bovine manure, so only cows, and it's got to be fresh. Once that patty is dried out, they don't want to lay their eggs in it. So this is why we call hornflies pasture flies, because really the conditions that you have in a feedlot situation, the manure isn't what a hornfly likes. And that's why we only see these hornflies on animals that are on pasture. So in addition to just decaying hay bales, anywhere, even on feed bunkers where you have feed spilling over, that's a prime habitat for stable fly development. Anywhere where there's plant material that is degrading, a stable fly is going to love. Our face flies, again, are pasture flies like our horn flies. They really like to have intact, fresh manure paddies. Our house flies, I like to call these our party flies because they really don't care. They will lay their eggs anywhere where there is something for these larvae to eat. So for all our flies, what they really are feeding on is, as the food source, the hay or the manure, it's got these microbes that are digesting all these things, and these larval flies are actually feeding off the microbes and the dissolved solids. So they're not actually eating the poop, they're eating the bacteria that live in the poop. So anywhere, even if you have just a little bit of soil that was contaminated by a bit of manure, houseflies can lay their eggs in that and do just fine. So houseflies, because of their just non-selective nature, really develop pretty much anywhere. So historically, what we've done to control our fly populations is by spraying pesticides. The problem is that resistance has happened, and it's bad in Kansas. So these are just 3 publications I pulled off the internet for specifically what they've tested in Kansas. And so the top one is for a housefly population, and what they've say here is based on comparison with historical data, the population collected from Kansas represents one of the most highly permethrin resistant populations ever sampled. So we have a problem with houseflies. The second one was relating to hornflies, and this was a survey that was done that said most fly populations had some degree of resistance. And then the last one is stable flies. And this was interesting because it ranged, but also we were seeing resistant to multiple classes of pesticides. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But these are largely outdated. And so I'm actually trying to get a handle on how bad the resistance problem is in Kansas. So if you think you have resistance, please contact me. I'll have my details up for a little bit at the end of this slide. So what this really means is, let's imagine the circle is our fly population. We've used pesticides for a long time, and now they're resistant to the pesticides. And we have a population who is still susceptible to the pesticides in blue. And then this yellow circle represents how many flies per animal that will cause economic damage to your animal. And so you're spraying your pesticides, and even though it might be removing the susceptible population, you're really not doing anything to the resistant population, no matter how much you spray. So what you really need to think about doing if you have encountered this resistance, and even just to slow the progression of resistance or onset of resistance, these are some things you can do. So let's say you have a resistant hornfly population, your pesticides aren't working anymore. What you can do is target areas of this fly that has absolutely nothing to do with pesticide use. So let's say, for example, you have walk-through traps. So this removes some of the population. Then let's say that in addition to this, you use patch burning, and also this removes some of the population. And then you have a healthy population of dung beetles, or maybe use one of the garlic additives or the alternatives to pesticide that I'm going to chat about right at the end. And then all of a sudden, you've really gone and reduced your population of flies, even without having to use pesticides. Then what you do is then you use your pesticides as your last step, and you remove the susceptible flies. And then all of a sudden your population has shrunk, even though they're still resistant to the pesticide, it's shrunk within this economically no longer damaging area for you. So what can you do that doesn't involve pesticides that can start to bring down these fly populations? So we're going to talk about some things that you can do for larval development. We're going to talk about some options for physical removal of adults. And then a question I get asked all the time is about these non-pesticidal alternatives like garlic. Do they actually work? So I'm going to show you some studies that have been performed that lead us to suggest that they might actually be beneficial. So one of the biggest things you can do is remove the development sites for these larvae. If you remove those sites, the females don't have anywhere to lay their eggs, or the larvae can't finish their development. And so you immediately dramatically reduce the population of adults that you have. So if you are in a confined cattle operation, a feedlot, or a confined dairy operation, remove and compost manure if you can. So the most important thing about composting is that as I said, the flies live off the microbes that are in this manure. When you are composting, the outside of your manure pile becomes dried and heated by the sun, so the bacteria can't survive there. And what happens on the inside is that the temperature actually rises, and you'll notice when you turn your manure piles that you get the steam coming off. That's that increased temperature where the microbes are digesting all the manure stuff, but it's too hot for the larval flies to develop. So composting is a great way to get rid of those larval flies. Covering feed components and avoiding having full bunkers. So if you mix your food on site, making sure that those are specifically your house flies and your stable flies can't get in there to start laying their eggs and feed off that material that might be hanging out there for a while. And I always suggest that you avoid having full bunkers as much as possible. I understand, you've got operations to run and it's easier to fill bunkers full and leave them for a longer time. But think of it this way, especially your house flies, they're feeding off that food. So all those house flies that you saw in that video on that bunker, they're just eating up all the sugars and the protein and the microbes that were used for the fermentation. So you're basically giving them a buffet, and they're eating until they're full and they're producing as many eggs as they can. And then they go lay those eggs and they come right back to the buffet. So if you limit their access to food, you limit the number of eggs they can produce. So that's a great way to reduce your population. Rotational grazing and patch burning is really great, especially for hornflies. There's a link to a YouTube video here from some of our collaborators at Oklahoma State. And what they showed is if you use patch burning, you can reduce your adult fly population by 40%. Just by doing that alone, you can reduce populations by almost half. Dung beetles are great. So what they do is they remove the manure and make it no longer accessible for the flies. So I read some old papers that showed that you could reduce your fly population and your worm burdens by about 90%. So I'm looking into doing some research that's getting us some more current numbers for how great dung beetles really, really are. Monitor your hay bales, especially as we're in wet weather, as you're coming out of winter. What you don't want to have is you don't want to have standing hay that is moist, that is starting to degrade, because that is just prime stable fly habitat. So avoid, if you can, remove old bales, spread it out. This also goes for if you're feeding cattle on crops that have crop residues. Anywhere where you have decaying plant matter, you're going to favor stable fly production. And then, so I've added here judicious deployment of insect growth regulators. So how these work is you feed them orally, they pass through the animal, they don't get absorbed, but they get excreted out in the manure. And so what these growth regulators do is they actually stop the pupal stage from completing and an adult emerging. So often I'll have people call me up and say, I don't think my insect growth regulator is working because I'm still seeing larvae. And so it doesn't actually kill the larvae. What it does is it inhibits that crucial development within the pupa. Remember the little casing that we saw at the bottom of our life cycle. And it inhibits the adult flies to develop properly and emerge. So if you do use insect growth regulators, you want to use them early. So this is a nice graph that shows you, depending on where you are in the country, when you should be starting to use them. So what you want to do is the moment that the adult flies that overwintered started waking up, and now with the warm weather we're having, this is going to happen pretty soon, you want to start using your insect growth regulators to stop them from even getting their first batch of eggs emerging into adults. Very important, correct dosing. So if you are using an insect growth regulator, you have to make sure that your animals are getting the correct dose, because if you are underdosing them, then what you're doing is you're actually providing a little bit of exposure to the compound, not enough to stop the growth, but enough for the organisms to start developing resistance. So it's a bit of a misconception out there that insects cannot get resistant to growth regulators. They can, they are. We're seeing it being published that there are resistant populations. So correct dosing is really, really important. And then also bear in mind that some of these products can have negative side effects for beneficial microorganisms, not microorganisms, beneficial insects, for example, your dung beetles. So often on the product, you can Google it and it will tell you whether or not it will negatively impact some of your resident dung beetle populations. So some strategies for removing adults. Walk-through traps for horn flies are super, super great. What they do is they scrape the flies off the back of the animal. The flies get contained within the trap. Once they're off the animal, they feed about 20 to 30 times a day. So once they're off the animal, they die pretty quickly. So if you can put a walk-through trap in a place where animals have to pass through daily, you can really significantly reduce your fly population. Stable flies, this doesn't work with as well. And something I forgot to mention about stable flies is where horn flies stay continuously associated with your animal, the stable flies will feed once or twice a day, and for the most part, they'll be off the animal when they're not resting. So if you're constantly seeing 8 to 10 flies on the legs of your animals, that's not the same 8 to 10 flies throughout the day. Those are multiple flies who are coming and going. So it's easy to think that you actually have fewer flies than you do. You can use attractant traps and traps that will actually, what they have is they have smells that the flies like. Here's a picture of a stable fly trap, and it will basically attract them to the trap and then they will die within the trap. Parasitoid wasps are really great. So what they do is they actually hunt out the pupal stage. They lay their egg inside the pupa, and then the developing wasp larvae actually eats up the fly in its pupal casing. The only downside of using a parasitoid wasp is that you cannot spray for anything, because your spray that you're using to kill the flies will also kill your wasps. So there's advantages and disadvantages to using parasitoid wasps. And garlic, so I have been asked, I can't tell you how many times does garlic work, because there's been these anecdotal studies that garlic can actually reduce your fly populations if you feed it to the animals. So this was really exciting. We finally have some published data out there that suggests that yes, garlic does help hornfly populations. So what they did in the study is they actually supplemented their mineral with between 2 and 5% garlic powder, and then they just fed it to the animals. They measured how much the animals took in, and the garlic didn't seem to make the animals consume more mineral, but it didn't make them consume any less either. So they don't seem to be too fazed by the taste of the product. And so this is what it does to hornfly populations. So the blue arrow tells you what happens, the number of hornflies in animals who didn't have the garlic. And then the green arrow shows you the number of flies on animals who did have the garlic. And you can see that it's really reduced that population. So they estimated it to be about 40% reduction. So importantly, also, you see a reduction in defensive behaviors with the animals. So what this is, it's leg stomping, it's flicking of the head, it's avoidance behaviors to get away from the flies. And this is really important, because if you're spending less time trying to get away from the flies, you're spending more time eating, which means you put on weight faster. Another thing that we also see is that when you look at the blood levels of the stress hormone cortisol, when you have high numbers of flies, that cortisol level actually increases. So the more flies you have, the more physiological stress the animal is under. And as we all know, when you're stressed, you tend to get sick easier. So by having fly numbers, you can also have animals be more susceptible to other infections. And we know that hornflies are great transmitters of mastitis. So more hornflies, not only are they transmitting more of this bacteria, but your animal is generally under more stress. So garlic, it seems to be, may actually be a great use of an alternative approach to start knocking back those adult animal numbers. And of course, the less effectively these flies feed, the fewer eggs they're going to produce, and it just keeps contributing to decreasing that population. Essential oils, we're getting more and more things getting published at the moment where they're trying different essential oils. And this was a geranium and lemongrass oil in sunflower oil. So theoretically, you could make this up yourself if you wanted to. And what it did is it reduced both hornflies and face fly numbers. So in blue at the top, you see the control, and in green, you see the treated cattle. So then there was also a publication that where they were actually looking at lice control, but they tested it against flies while they were at it. And what they really saw was an aversion of these flies to camphor, peppermint, chamomile, and onion. And the component, and so their control there is a neutral substance. And so while we're not necessarily killing the flies with these products, what we are doing is we're dissuading them from feeding on the animal. So by dissuading them from feeding, or not for feeding as long as they would like, you're decreasing the number of eggs it can produce and reducing that population. They also looked at catnip oil. And so what they did here is they actually made these catnip oil pellets and put it out on the pens. And then they looked to see what the stable flies were doing. So in red, what you see is after the application, 5 minutes after the application, and this black bar here, which is your before application, it goes away completely. So the stable flies did not like the smell of this catnip oil. After 3 hours, it still has some effect, but you can see here after 24 hours, what had happened is the catnip, the chemicals that the flies dislike had actually escaped from the pellets, and it was no longer effective. So what we see a lot of the time is publications that show that these products are really, really effective, but there's a bit of a gap between a scientist saying that, yeah, these things work, and companies actually taking it up and having them available as products. So I'm really excited this summer that we're actually going to test a product that is based on essential oils. It's through a commercial company, and it's shown really great promise in the lab, and we're going to use it on some cattle. So what we are seeing is that now that the demand for alternative products is increasing, that companies are now investing the money into developing these products. So hopefully soon you'll be able to buy products that you can use that are going to be part of an integrated control program for flies. So the last thing that I'm going to quickly talk about is chemical removal of adults. So this is, your things that you're probably more familiar with doing. Chemical classes are important. So you want to rotate class in our products, and you can find what ingredient your control product has on the label. So here it is in yellow. So these are two different products. They contain the same class ingredients. So if you rotate it between permethrin and ultraboss, you're actually not changing product class, and you would be selecting for resistance. So what we suggest is that you alternate yearly. You're probably more familiar with the old thing that we used to recommend, which was 2 years of pyrethroids, 1 year of organophosphate, but we're actually seeing too much resistance to both these products. So now what we actually suggest you do is rotate every year, 1 year pyrethroids, 1 year organophosphates, and then 1 year macrocyclic lactons. And as you'll see here, I have them highlighted in purple. This is the different group number. So you can see each one belongs to a different group. And if you're curious about the groups, you can just click on the link at the top, and it will tell you more information about the groups. If you get resistance to any one of them, stop using them for about 2 years. You don't want to use it anywhere closer than 2 years. And hopefully by removing that pressure, you will, you can't really reverse the resistance, but it should hopefully, you can try it again after 2 years, and maybe it will work again. Ear tags for pasture fly control. So this is going to be your horn flies and your face flies. So they are available for pyrethroids, organophosphates, and macrocyclic lactons. So you can still do this rotation using ear tags. Apply them to both ears. And so this is important. So how these products work is the pesticide is contained within the tag, and as the animals are moving and rubbing on each other, they are transferring the pesticide from the tag onto the skin of the animal. If you only put tags in one ear, it's cheaper, but you're also only covering half your animal. So put tags in both ears, and importantly, remove after use. So tagging time is important. So if you look at the product label for these products, they will tell you that you can use them for 3 to 5 months. So I wanted you guys to think about them more like a Sharpie pen. So when you get a Sharpie pen and it's brand new and you pull it out of your package, it works really, really well. And they might tell you, yeah, you can write on 100 sheets of paper. But after you get about to sheet 50, you'll notice that the pen still writes, but it's not as dark as it used to be. And maybe if you're using it for a presentation, people at the back can't see it because it's too light. It's the same thing with your tag. Along with time, it's less and less potent. So you don't want to put your fly tag on in the beginning of the season where you have no flies out. By the time you reach the critical time where your maximum amount of flies is up, you already are in that time of the Sharpie where it's starting to rub out. So wait till your fly populations are at their highest, and you should know it's normally around June, July. And then use your tagging then. Also avoid using tags in bulls who are pretty large because their necks are too thick and they can't really move from side to side. If they are with cows, then they will get transfer from the cows. The same for calves that haven't been weaned. The mother will actually transfer some of her pesticide from her tag onto the calf. And they work really, really successfully if you couple them with an insect growth regulator. So if you start using your IGR early in the season, and then when your fly populations start reaching those higher levels, then you can go ahead and use your fly tags. So hopefully now you know a little bit more about the flies and their biology. And what that will do is I'm hoping that you guys can go to your systems and say, okay, where do I have areas where flies could breed? What can I do to clear up those areas so it's less hospitable to the breeding of flies? Hopefully, you can use some multiple approaches that are tailored to your operation in ways that you can start reducing that fly burden so that the onus isn't fully on the pesticides to do all the work. We have to help our pesticides a little bit, and we have to not make them do all the heavy lifting. Any way you can reduce that fly population without using pesticides is going to be fantastic. It's going to decrease the spread of resistance, and that's something that we all need. And I will say, in terms of alternative approaches, things like your garlic powder and your patch burning and your traps, anything is better than nothing. So remember, none of these things are going to take care of the entire population in one go. We're trying to chip away at it and just remove as many flies as we can using different options. And so this is where you can find me. My email address is really easy to remember. It's cold, so think of it if it's cold outside, at ksu.edu. Also, if you look on our Department of Entomology website, you can find me. If you have any questions about this or anything else related to your livestock pests, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm here to provide a service to you all. So I'm going to stop sharing and see. I don't know if we have any questions or if we should move straight on to AJ's talk.
I would say if anybody has questions, that'd be an excellent time to ask Cassandra, because you know, we have her here for the evening. Let's use her. You know, anybody have any questions? You can unmute and ask.
And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to put my email address here in the chat box so that you can just copy and paste it.
Cassandra, what about dragging pastures? You know, that's a thing that you hear about some, but you know, that's a piece of equipment. It costs quite a lot of money. What's your opinion?
You know, it seems to be mixed. Opinions seem to be mixed about it. Theoretically, yes, because you're disturbing that manure. Anything you can do to disturb that manure patty and, you know, break it apart, it's going to dry out faster. And your phase flies and your horn flies, the moment that patty is disturbed, the moment it dries out, they're like, I'm done. They don't even recognize it as a source. And specifically horn flies, they're so tailored to the bovine host that they cannot develop in anybody else's manure. So you can have tons and tons of horse manure out there, but they're not going to develop in it. So, you know, by spreading out that manure, theoretically, yes, it will work. Practically, and it would help for worms too. There's indications that it helps to reduce your worm burden. But practically, how easy it is to do, you know, like you said, it's an expensive piece of machinery. You've got to do it quite often because the cattle are constantly pooping. So in terms of practicality, I would say that if you're going to invest money, I like the physical traps, especially if you can put them in an area where cattle have to pass through every day, because then every day you're scraping off the flies, you're removing those adult populations entirely. So I really love traps for that reason, because they're instantaneous. They get the adults off, and then you have fewer adults laying eggs in those patties, which are slightly harder to control. So I would say if patch burning, definitely, I mean, 40% reduction just by patch burning alone, that I would recommend over a pasture dragging. And also patch burning, I believe, also reduces your worm population. But dung beetles will do both. Dung beetles significantly reduce your worm population and your hornfly population. So if you can promote these dung beetles, I mean, that's about as good as you can get.
If you're using an IGR though, are you going to kill the dung beetles that you have present?
Possibly. So a lot of the companies will say, oh, we tested it and it doesn't kill them. But there's actually multiple species of dung beetles, and companies are really good about not testing them against all dung beetles. So they'll test it against one species and say, oh, no, it's fine. But so at a low level, it seems like they're okay with it. But if you have high levels of these IGRs, so let's say you get your dosing incorrect and you're overdosing, you will kill your dung beetles. So theoretically, for the dung beetles that they tested on, it shouldn't kill them. But honestly, I'm always very suspicious when anybody's trying to sell me something. I always ask, is it in their best interest to be super upfront about what it might do to beneficial organisms? You know, they want to sell their product, so of course they're going to say, oh no, it's fine with dung beetles, but you know, really, how many species did they test it against and stuff like that. So something that I'm super excited about dung beetles. So it's not an area that I do research on now, but it's an area that I'm going to get into, because I want to know how they are affecting these dung beetles by me testing it, who doesn't have a vested interest in selling a product. And also, how can we promote the growth of these dung beetles and possibly rear them in a lab situation, and then be able to send them out to farmers to deploy in their fields. Add one more thing. There was one fly that I didn't talk about, and that are your tabanids, so your horse flies, and they are pretty difficult to control in general. So a hornfly, a horsefly, because there's so many different species, and each species has their own preference for habitat. Sometimes when you try and remove one habitat, like standing water, you actually favor the development of another species. So these horseflies are a little bit tricky to control. So if anybody thinks they have a problem with horseflies, get in touch with me. We can try and see what kind of horseflies you have and what you can do to control that population of it.
Well, it does seem like mid-July, or a lot of times there's a lot of horseflies out there, so you may be getting some calls.
Send them my way. Send them my way.
All right. All right. Anybody else have any questions before we move on to our second topic for the evening? Well, Cassandra, thank you very much. We'll be in touch with you. Appreciate your presentation this evening, and I'm sure you'll hear from some of us here sometime this summer, I'm sure.